Chapter 15, Lesson 3, The War Ends, and Not a Moment Too Soon. So, the war went on for many years, about 4 years, and in the North, the draft was instituted, which meant that anyone who was basically in the North, who was a man, could be drafted, and it was really, really rough and really, really unpopular because one of the things that one of the ways that you could actually get out of being in the draft was if you paid someone to go ahead and fight. And so some people argued it was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. And that ended up being really unpopular. If you were from 20 to 45, you could be drafted, or you were drafted into the Union Army. And very, very difficult situation being coming into. In the South, the Union blockade of the ports made supplies really scarce and very expensive. So things were rougher actually down south. In terms of the Battle of the South, Lincoln put Ulysses S. Grant, in charge of the Union Army after the Battle of Vicksburg. One of the reasons why he took Meade out, General Meade, who was in charge at the Battle of Gettysburg, was because he felt that Meade did not pursue Lee, and that could have actually ended the war then. But Meade was taking care of his own wounded for good reasons. But Lincoln wanted someone who was going to pursue the war as viciously as necessary, and that was Grant. He in the east, and then his partner William Tecumseh Sherman in the west, wore down the Confederate forces. And Sherman, what he did was he marched eventually from Vicksburg through Georgia. He destroyed anything of value along the way. It was total warfare. Didn't care if it was someone else's property. Didn't care. Just destroyed everything. As a matter of fact, these were nicknamed Sherman's bow ties because they were railroad tracks. They would just twist so that they could never be used again. And he burned Atlanta, or at least some people think he burned Atlanta. Some people think that Atlanta just burned. And he makes it all the way to Savannah, destroying every army that met them. And again, this is his march, and just he's destroying everything along the way. A huge swath of destruction, hundreds of miles wide. And his whole idea was, I'm going to take the fight out of them, punish them to make it so they want to give up. Now, Grant and Lee were fighting still between Richmond and Washington, and Grant moves methodically towards Richmond, had horrific losses, but he kept going because he knew it could resupply better. If he fought a battle and he lost 20,000 men and Lee lost 10,000 men, he considered it a strategic victory because Lee didn't have the supply of men that he could get back, but Grant did. In the election of 1864, many thought Lincoln would actually lose because this is before Atlanta fell, and the war was dragging on. Some actually wanted peace talks and to negotiate. As a matter of fact, the guy who goes up against Lincoln was none other than George McClellan, the general who had fought at Antietam and fought a bunch of battles pretty unsuccessfully in a lot of ways. But then he goes up against, as a Democrat, goes up against Lincoln. And his opponent, McClellan, wanted a ceasefire. The victory at Atlanta changed many people's minds, and then Lincoln, towards Lincoln, and actually McClellan changes his position in the end. And also Lincoln ends up winning about 55% to 45%, so it's a pretty easy victory for him. After his election, this is what the movie Abraham Lincoln, or Lincoln that just came out, was about. And it's about how, after he's reelected, he called for the Constitution to be changed to ban slavery, to make it so it would never happen again under the Constitution. And in 1865, the 13th Amendment was added and was ratified, and that got rid of slavery forever. So yes, and so a lot of people, particularly the freed African Americans, viewed him as sort of this Moses-like figure in some ways, like freeing the slaves, and well, they felt really bad when he got assassinated, but that's leading ahead in the story. So Richmond fell eventually, and Grant was closing in with his 125,000 troops on Lee's 35,000 troops. The Union cut off Lee's supplies, and Lee eventually surrenders on April 9th, 1865, at this place called Appomattox Courthouse. The war was pretty much over. There was still some fighting that kept going further west and some other places. Jefferson Davis was captured in May, and so, yeah, basically the war is over. 5 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln went to see a play with his wife and another couple. A pretty happy day for him. Apparently, it was a Good Friday, which is always kind of one of those ironies. A famous actor named John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln from point blank range in the head and then fled the theater. Lincoln died the next day. Booth evaded capture for several days afterwards, but then eventually does get captured, and he gets killed when the barn he's inside is set on fire to sort of flush him out, and then he dies. So the troops do return home. Much of the South was destroyed, and their way of life was changed forever. In the North, there was a huge sense of relief at the war being over, so people could get back to their everyday lives. So after 4 years of war, the South was in ruins. 620,000 people had died. 1 in 10 white men from the South had died, and the South had lost 2/3 of its wealth. So now the job comes to Andrew Johnson, the next president, Lincoln's vice president, and the rest of the country to figure out how to put this mess back together again. That's what Reconstruction is all about.